The story I am about to tell is difficult for me to talk about for two reasons. One is that the main part took place when I was around 4 or 5 years old, which makes it difficult to remember most details surrounding the story, which is part of the reason it's haunted me for 20 years. The other reason is that this story makes me feel uneasy to even really think about, and this might be only the third time I've ever really told it in full. So quick background to this story is that I was born and raised in an extremely close, big family. We all lived within about a mile from each other, around a large park in a small Texas town. Unrelated fun fact for those horror fans out there, this park is the present-day location of the majority of the town that dreaded Sundown murders. Now, my family is jam-packed full of aunts and uncles, and I'd say I saw them all at least once a week for my entire childhood. I can't stress enough how close we all were growing up, and how trusted they all were, as it plays an important part to the story. So, this story came up recently between my older brother, my mother and I, because I opened up about a series of nightmares I have been basically plagued with for as long as I can remember. These nightmares are always very similar and basically always consist of me, as a small child in my childhood home, attempting to escape my house while something horrible chases me. The something is never actually visually seen, but is more like I sense this massive, looming person reaching out at me from the dark, and it always catches me before I can get outside. This usually results in me waking up in a sweat. These dreams always seem to center around these very vague yet oddly detailed memories of a babysitter I once had. Here's where it gets odd. These memories I have are almost like dreams. I very specifically remember the details of what was happening and the feelings I had during, but everything else was just out of reach. That goes for the babysitter herself as well. I remember it was a white female who was middle-aged, but I can't for the life of me recall her face. In my memories, it's like I never really got a good look at her. The two specific incidences I remember were not happy ones. The first memory I have is that whenever I would get in trouble, what for I have no memory of, I would be forced to sit outside in the back porch in shorts and a t-shirt during winter. I remember because I would shiver and just sit there quietly, scared complaining would cause more problems. The second memory was even worse to me. The babysitter loved to play this game she made up. She would turn off all lights in the house and go hide deep in one of the back rooms. I was left in the front room and told that if I wanted food or to watch TV, I had to find her first. I never had any idea where she was hiding, and if I ever found her, she would jump out screaming like a mad woman and chase me. I remember her laughter at my fear. I remember often being so frozen with terror that I would sit on the ground near the front door, too scared to go find her. No matter how long I waited, she would never come out of hiding. No matter how hungry I got. I specifically remember this one time very well. I was so little and scared. I was whimpering as I slowly built up bravery to walk the back hallway, looking for her. My hunger felt deadly at this point, and I needed to find her. I checked bathrooms, bedrooms, closets, and nothing. She was nowhere. I remember standing in my parents' bedroom, trying to figure out where she could be, when I saw her. She was a dark shape under the big bed, peeking at me from under the bedskirt. We stared at each other, unmoving. I couldn't make out her face, but I knew she was smiling at me. She was like a crazy, feral animal under there. I remember her sliding herself along the floor so fast. I screamed and turned to run as she made it to her feet. And then the memory goes dark. I don't know what happened after that, and that scares me just as much as the memory I do have of the event. I never shared these memories because they seemed so distant, and I often wondered if they were even real. One day, when I was in my 20s, I mentioned the nightmares to my mother and brother when we were just sitting around talking during one of the weeks where my brother and I were home from college. We often would do this to tell funny stories and remember all of the kids we knew from long before. Then I decided to ask my mother about the babysitter. She seemed confused and told me she never hired babysitters for either I or my brother. Because of how big and close my family was and how protective my mum was of us, she never trusted anyone but family to watch us. My aunts and grandmother were the absolute opposite of the woman I remember. Loving, kind, fun, and treated me like one of their own children. I couldn't imagine them doing those things to me. My mum genuinely seemed confused, but also slightly worried, like a mother would be when hearing such a horrible story. She told me she truly couldn't even begin to imagine who I was talking about. With her certainty, and with the memories being so vague in important places, I decided I must have imagined it all. Then, my brother brought it up again the next day when we were driving together. "Yeah, I remember that," he said, with some concern in his voice. "Like, I remember seeing you get taken outside and being forced to sit there, and I thought it was horrible. I don't know why we never told anyone." He too had no memory of who the woman was, but he remembers feeling defenseless over the whole thing. He only had vague memories of the horrible games she would play, but pointed out how he has absolutely no memory of her ever targeting him with her torment. He remembers the events as if he were an audience member. He did, however, remember things I didn't. This included that I often got in trouble because I would use my imagination to tell stories, and that the babysitter would get mad when she realized it was not true. This resulted in me getting kicked out of the house. I just want to point out that my brother is only 1 year older than I am, so he too would have been very little. I have thought about bringing it back up to my mum, but I honestly trust that she has no idea who I am talking about, and I don't want to make her feel horrible about something so long ago that she clearly has no idea about. I just wish I could understand what happened and who she was. My brother never brought it up again after, but told me at the time that he had always played that memory off as being so young and just misunderstanding whatever was happening. All I do know is babysitter from my nightmares. Let's never meet again. Not even in my sleep. I grew up in the Midwest. About 10 years ago, I moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, where I work for a company that runs cabins and a water taxi service, transporting campers and hunters, and sometimes prey, to various locations, sometimes just 20 minutes away, sometimes hours away. During the winter a few years ago, we had a couple staying in one of our very basic cabins, like the kind of cabin you'd stay in at summer camp. My understanding was the guy, Dick, was taking a class at the trade school in town, so he'd be gone all day, while the woman, Jane, stayed at the cabin with their 3 dogs. We never saw her outside while he was away. One day, Jane bursts into the office in tears, hysterical. She told us Dick had been beating her for days, starving her, that he'd been locking her in the cabin while he was away, that he even threatened her with his dogs. We immediately called the police to the office, and while we waited for them to arrive, she told us the details of their relationship. She'd met Dick on a social media site, and he sold her on this bogus dream of building a remote lodge, and had even convinced her to transfer all this money she had just inherited to his bank account, which he spent on a remote piece of property, a new truck, and a boat, among other things. Jane was totally at Dick's mercy. She'd voluntarily transferred the money to him. It was evident that she'd grown up wealthy. She didn't seem to have any idea of how to take care of herself. By the time the police arrived, she had reversed her story. She wouldn't tell them he'd hit her, threatened her, or locked her in the cabin. I walked over to the cabin with the officer to talk to Dick, and of course he denied everything. The cop was very frustrated. It was clear Dick was mistreating her, but he didn't have enough to make an arrest. I told Dick he needed to leave the property anyway. I didn't want him there, and the woman didn't want to go with him. Jane had managed to get in touch with a friend in the US who bought her a plane ticket, and another employee and I had offered to drive her to the airport in the city, about 200 miles away, that very night. Dick left without issue, and the last thing I said to him was, "Don't come back," and that if I ever saw his truck in our area again, I would assume he was there to cause trouble, and would call the police without hesitation. I felt terrible for the woman. She'd basically made a bad investment and had little hope of recovering any of that money. Months pass. It was well into the summer, and I had all but forgotten about this incident. I had heard Jane had gone back to Dick, and that they were back in town from another water taxi operator. He had been transporting them to and from their remote property, because Dick wrecked the boat he bought with Jane's money on the rocky beach. One day, I answered a phone call from a very distraught woman from the other side of the country. She was desperately trying to find her son, who had answered an ad Dick had posted online, looking for help doing construction at this remote property. She had just been calling water taxi operators in the area, asking if anyone knew this guy, Dick. Apparently her son Mike had called her from a satellite phone out of the property and told her he was in danger. They weren't getting along, and Dick finally ran him off. This property was out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by sea or air, no roads. You can't just tell someone to leave. Where would they go? Mike's mother relayed to me that Dick wouldn't let him sleep in the cabin, that he wouldn't share food, and that he'd even chased him with a rifle when he realized Mike had a satellite phone. It was lucky he'd managed to get the call out. Mike's mother called with the intention of hiring us to pick up her son. I told her, "Miss, this is an emergency. We need to contact the police." I contacted the state police and Coast Guard immediately, and they jointly dispatched a boat and a helicopter to the area to rescue this guy. Mike was rescued safely, and Dick was arrested. Jane was there too, but refused to come back with the police and stayed at the cabin. Mike came out to the office a few days later to meet me. He gave me a big hug and thanked me. He was convinced I'd saved his life, which was a nice sentiment, but in my opinion, the police and Coast Guard saved his life. He told me some more details of his experience. That Dick had actually taken several shots at him while chasing him through the woods. He told me when Dick caught up to him, he held him at gunpoint, ordered him to strip naked, and locked him in a shipping container that he had on the property. He was convinced he was going to die. He was still locked in the shipping container when the state police arrived. Mike didn't stay for long, but I was impressed that he took the time to come out and introduce himself, and I wished him luck. Dick was charged with attempted murder, but I believe those charges were ultimately dropped, and that Mike ended up with a hefty settlement from that inheritance money Dick had swindled from Jane. I received a phone call later that summer from a reporter in the city asking about what had happened. Mike's mother had given him my information. I agreed to tell him what I knew on the condition that he not mention my name or the name of the company I work for, which he mentioned anyway. The other night, I was having a few beers with my neighbor, Al, a young guy who moved to town last year. This story popped up in my head, and when I mentioned Dick's name, he perked up. They worked together at the shipyard. I can't believe it. Dick is back in town. Without Jane this time, working a minimum wage job. Additionally, it turns out Jane is still around as well. I don't know if they're still together, but I hope for her sake she's moved on. So Dick, you Lord of the Flies psychopath, let's not meet.